Like the office they commemorate, presidential libraries are living institutions. Certainly it is my hope that the Reagan Library will become a dynamic intellectual forum where scholars interpret the past and policymakers debate the future.
Welcome to a Reagan Forum, hosted by the Ronald Reagan Presidential Foundation and Institute. The Center for Public Affairs offers lectures and forums presenting perspectives on important public policy issues of the day from politicians, authors, members of the media, business and military leaders, and more. On August 14, 2024, the Reagan Foundation hosted an in-person event with former Secretary of Commerce Wilbur Ross for a discussion on his latest book, Risks and Returns: Creating Success in Business and Life. Risks and Rewards explains how Wilbur Ross got to the top and stayed there. Rising from humble beginnings in New Jersey, he applied simple principles with strict discipline, something readers can apply in their own quest for success. The book is a candid reflection of a life lived at the pinnacle of Wall Street, New York, and Palm Beach society, as well as within the Trump administration in his role as Commerce Secretary. During the program, Secretary Ross sat down in conversation with Reagan Foundation and Institute President and CEO David Trulio to discuss his career in business and politics. Let's listen.
Well, thank you for being here and making the trip. I thought we would start at the beginning, which is tell us a little bit about your upbringing. What were your mom and dad like? What was it like growing up in New Jersey?
Well, my mother and father were both Democratic political operatives in Hudson County, New Jersey, which is an infamously Democratic area. And my first exposure to it was when I was a very young boy. They took me down to see Frank Hague, the mayor of Jersey City and the boss. He had just gotten a new apartment on the top of the Jersey City Medical Center, which had just then been constructed. Gorgeous apartments, floor-to-ceiling glass, panoramic view of New Jersey and New York City. And so he asked me, well, what did I think about it? Well, I'd never seen anything like it. So I was a little bit goggle-eyed. I said, well, Mayor Hague, may I ask you a question? How did you get such a marvelous apartment? And he said, you'd be amazed. It was a present. I said, a present? That's quite an amazing present. And he said, yes, you'd be astonished at how many nice presents people give me. Your parents will explain it to you on the way back to your house. So that was the first sort of blush with that. I was a scrawny kid and a bookworm when I was young. Still, both are pretty much true. And so I was not very good at baseball or basketball or football. But one day my paternal grandfather took me to a recreation hall that had a bowling alley. He was a very good bowler. He had actually bowled 300 games, which are perfect games. Anyhow, I wasn't too interested in bowling. The ball was too heavy for me to play with anyway. But it also had a rifle range. And so turned out I had a very natural affinity for marksmanship. And went on at age 14, I won the New Jersey State Championship. At age 16, I set the US record over the Olympic small bore rifle course. And that was my first real lesson in management.
Well, and you point out in the book that marksmanship played a big role in your future success. You said, intense concentration on hitting the target became a metaphor for my entire life.
Yes.
Can you elaborate on that?
Well, that's true, because unlike many sports, which are true team sports, well, we had a team. I was at a Jesuit military school. Well, we had a team. At the end of the day, it was just you and the target. And the question was, how many times could you hit it where you were supposed to hit it and not have a failure? So there was only one thing to concentrate on. And you had to learn to control your breathing and keep your emotion down and all that sort of self-control activity. But it turned out to be good training, and it helped me to focus. And focus, I think, is a singularly important thing in everything that you do, concentration and focus. If you get distracted too easily, you waste time. The typical bureaucrat shuffling paper rather than dealing with the paper. So it was very important to me. But this one event where I set the record taught me a little bit about management. Winchester by then was my sponsor, and that was very good because I needed help to buy the ammunition and stuff like that, and the entry fees for the tournaments. And they wanted me to take time off from school and really get ready for the Olympics, which I decided not to do. But this day we're shooting, and it's outdoors, 100 meters, and a .22 caliber rifle the shells and the bullets are very susceptible to wind. So they would have two targets. One was the real target, and one was a practice target. So as the wind changed, you'd shoot at the practice target to adjust your sights so you could deal with it. So they gave me this fellow as a spotter to count the rounds that I had fired and make sure that I didn't overcount or undercount. So when they announced the record, it seemed too low on the prone part. It was prone, kneeling, and standing. Prone is the simplest because you're supported, you're lying on the ground. And I felt it was 9 or 10 points too low. So Winchester paid the protest fee, and it turned out he had not counted correctly. And so I set the record without having fired as many shots as you were supposed to. So it made a kind of a bittersweet thing. But what I learned from it was you can delegate authority, but at the end of the day, responsibility stays with you. Then therefore you really have to monitor. So instead of being a little lazy about it, which turned out I was, I didn't keep track myself. I just totally relied on him. The last time I ever totally relied on a supporting person. So it was an important lesson, and it happened to come in a very strange package, namely the joy of setting a record and the annoyance at having been so stupid not to shoot the right number of rounds. So
amazing, and obviously this crucial lesson stuck with you, and we're talking about it 6 decades probably later, right?
Yeah, I wasn't in the shooting business in order to learn that lesson, but it stuck with me. Probably as a result, I tend to be a bit of a micromanager, which I've noticed is something a lot of entrepreneurs end up doing.
Well, I do want to, in a moment, get to your career on Wall Street, of course, but tell us about some of your jobs growing up.
Yeah. Well, the first job that I had with a real employer, not just mowing lawns or doing things like that, I was hired right after I got my driver's license as a car parker at Monmouth Park Jockey Club in Oceanport, New Jersey. So the first day, I showed up with about 19 other teenagers to learn what we had to do to be car parkers. Louis, the lot boss, who was a Teamster, naturally the Teamsters, and it being New Jersey, if it moved, they had to organize it. So the parking attendants were organized by the Teamsters. And Louis, the lot boss, explained to us that there would be accidents, naturally, especially at the end of the day when everybody's in a hurry to get the car back. And he said, now, here's the drill. If you bang up the guy's car and he notices it before he leaves the track will have to pay for the damage, and you'll get set down from your job for a week. And if that happens twice, you get fired. So here's what you do. If you've damaged the guy's car, you have to distract him as you bring the car to him. And if it's a convertible, if the top were down, put the top up while you're coming. And so he'll scream and yell, "What are you doing putting my top up?" But he won't
Crank
notice.
the music up too was another one.
He won't notice the front headlight is busted. Or if it's not a convertible, turn on the radio real loud and turn on the windshield wipers. And the same thing, he'll say, "What the heck are you doing?" But he won't notice the damage. So here was a management person teaching kids how to defraud the business's customers. I thought this is a very unusual concept of business. It didn't seem quite right, even as a kid. But it got worse than that. He went on to say, now, you know you're just getting paid minimum wage, and you'll get a few little tips. In those days, a quarter was a pretty good tip. So you can live off that as best you can, or you can buy concessions from me. I thought, buy concessions? What on earth could this be? And the concessions were things like this. You would be amazed how many people leave locked in the car while they're at the track for 6 or 8 hours on a hot, sunny day, a child and or a pet, a dog or a cat or something. So one of the concessions was you would park their car in the shade under the trees so that whoever was trapped in the car would have a little less unpleasant experience. And the idea was you would keep half of the $2 and he would get the other half of the $2. So there were various concessions like that. They were innocent enough, but here we had a guy who was a paid employee, a lower level management guy, and he was making all this money on the side. Another strange aspect of working for a fairly large company. So that gave me a very poor idea of capitalism, because this was my first real exposure to a decent-sized business. And I later learned it was happily not at all typical. American business people are, based on my experience, the most law-abiding and the most moral of any business community that I've been exposed to. So I got a funny set of immersion into a little strange segment. It also taught me something else, because one of the kids decided he didn't need to buy a concession. He was inventing his own concession. And here's what his concession was. If you were the first car he parked, he would tell you, "I know who's going to win the first race." And he would tell you it's the 1 horse. And if you were the next one, he would tell you, "I know who's going to win the first race." And he'd tell you the 2 horse. And he'd tell you the 3, the 4, the 5. So every 9 or 10 cars, because there were usually 9 or 10 entries, every 9 or 10 cars, he'd have a winner. And that winner would usually come back to him after the first race, because they naturally wanted to know who was going to win the second race. And he said, "I gave you the first race free. Now you have to give me $10 for me to tell you the winner of the second race." Then he'd go through the same thing, and if he would have a few winners even of the second. And when they came back, he would charge them $25 to tell them who was going to win the third. The game very rarely lasted after 3 races, because you ran out of the number of people versus the number of horses. Strangest part about it to me was none of the people who lost ever came back and complained at him. And my guess is it's because the wives probably said to them, it was usually the husband who bet on this scam. My guess is the wives probably said, you're a real idiot. Would you think a kid running around a parking lot had any idea who the heck was going to win the race? And so the guy was probably a little too embarrassed to come back. That taught me about scams. It's always somebody who's trying to do something a little over the edge who's victim to a scam. If they don't have a little sense of larceny, they won't fall for it, because it's always the scammer is alleging he'll give you something you're not entitled to. So it was a good lesson, and it lived up to the Wall Street motto, if it seems too good to be true, it probably is too good to be true.
So you thought you were going to go back to parking cars one summer when you were in college,
Yes.
but you got a call from a mentor. Mentorship features prominently in your book.
Yes.
So tell us, if you would, about that call and what launched you on your career on Wall Street.
Yeah, the faculty advisor at Yale to my fraternity was one of the senior officers of the investment portfolio management. Yale, as you probably know, has had a very famous, very successful portfolio management for years. So he called me on April 1st. And you'll see April 1st is a recurring theme in my life. Anyway, he called me on April 1st and he said, Wilbur, what are you going to do this summer? And I said, well, Mr. Isleib, I suppose I'll go park cars again, just like I've been doing. And he said, no, I'm leaving the university. I'm joining as a partner in Investment Boutique in New York, and you're going to come with me as my clerk, and you're going to learn something that could be useful to you in later life. I thought, wow. But because it was April Fool's Day, I thought maybe he was just teasing me. So I waited a few minutes, and I called him back, and I said, are you serious? And he said, yes, he was, and I did. And this was a total contrast. So here's my second real experience in corporate America. It was a firm called Buckner & Co. Pete Buckner was one of the son-in-laws of Tom Wilson, who had founded IBM. So he knew a lot of wealthy people and was wealthy. And he was also a very religious man. And that was the one bad part about the job. I was living still in North Bergen, New Jersey, and you had to be in the office in Midtown Manhattan at 8 a.m. Well, so I had to leave the house at 6:30 to get there. Why 8 a.m.? Because that was when Mr. Buckner would read a section from the Bible, and then you would meditate on it for a minute or two, and then you'd get on with talking about the day's investment program. So I went from a pretty corrupt atmosphere at the racetrack to an atmosphere that could not be more different, but happily was much more like the rest of my life.
And obviously this was a very special call that you got that brought you in, but you decided that you wanted to make a career out of being in finance. And so what was your thinking around that, and what led you further down this path?
Well, it was a bunch of things. I've always been pretty analytical, always been a bookworm, and those are two very useful characteristics for being on Wall Street. And in fact, a professor I had later on gave me a memorable saying. He said, the only stupid question is the question you forgot to ask. And there's a lot of wisdom to that. Anyhow, so I enjoyed it. They taught me very quickly about accounting, and it turned out I had a pretty good knack for that. So I learned the beauties of double entry, bookkeeping, accounting. But I liked the process, and I liked listening to them as they went through their deliberations, what they were buying into. Turned out they often bought securities that were out of favor, sometimes distressed. One of them was defaulted West Virginia Turnpike bonds. The bonds were financed with debt, naturally, based on projections about how much traffic there would be on the toll road. And it turned out, there was traffic and it grew, but not as rapidly as they had hoped. So the bonds went into default, and every day they were buying these bonds. And they finally helped organize the restructuring of the Turnpike Authority, and they doubled their money in no time at all. So that was interesting, because at first I was puzzled. Wait a minute, this is bad. It's in default. It's a very bad situation. How could that be a good investment? Well, it turned out it was very good.
Depends on the price, right?
Yeah.
Right.
So that was, I didn't realize it at the time, but that was something that eventually led me to the distressed world.
And so tell us more about that journey into the distressed world that you, as I mentioned earlier, you were the king of bankruptcy. What drew you to that? In the book, you talk about the U.S. Bankruptcy Code and how that is essentially a national asset. That my word's not yours.
It is.
But can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Yeah. I started out working at an investment boutique, an institutional research firm, and did pretty well there. I then went to work for a very hotshot money manager called Imre DeVay, and as I was getting out of the military, I had gotten deferral from my second lieutenancy in the Army to let me go to business school. So when I got out, I had to go into the military. And in those days, in theory, you would go in for 6 months and then 7.5 years of reserves. But it happened to be the Cuban Missile Crisis, so I got to spend 18 months instead of 6. Imre DeVay, the week before I was to join the firm, died, and on his deathbed sold the business to Robert Winthrop of the Massachusetts Winthrops, very wealthy man, and who had been a very good client of theirs. So I suddenly changed jobs, and I hadn't even shown up yet. Then a week later, or a couple weeks later, in came Jack Dorrance, who then was the CEO of Campbell Soup, one of our main clients. And between himself and the pension fund of Campbell Soup, they had several $1 billion with us. So he was obviously trying to learn, was the new regime, this new fellow who had bought the firm, going to be comparable in performance to the old one? So at one point, he said to Mr. Winthrop, Bob, I notice our portfolios have a lot of shares of Lucky Friday silver mines in them. Why do we have Lucky Friday silver mines? Mr. Winthrop turned to me and he said, Wilbur, do my portfolios have Lucky Friday silver mines too? And I said, yes, sir, all of our portfolios have some Lucky Friday silver mines, and here's why, and went into the story. Dorrance said, well, thank you, I understand it. That ended the lunch. The following Monday, they pulled the $3 billion of accounts because it was clear the new head of the firm had no idea what they were doing. So 2 weeks later, he went to a board meeting at Citibank. Dick Perkins then was the CEO of Citibank, and he was complaining about this mistake he had made buying DeVay and how embarrassing it was to be called out the way that he was. So Perkins said, well, I have a solution for you. Sam Milbank is wanting to retire from Wood Struthers, a nice old line Wall Street firm. If you would replace his $10 million of capital with yours, they'll call it Wood Struthers and Winthrop. Nobody will ever again put you on the spot. So he did. So now I changed jobs for the second time. At least this time I had gotten a paycheck in between, so it wasn't quite as bad as the first change. Wood Struthers was a very conservative firm, very professional but conservative, so they didn't like the idea of the venture capital fund that we had had as part of our operation. So they fired the entire staff of that fund and made me a VP with one of their partners, the president. And my job was to get them out of all their investments. And if I could do that within 3 years with no litigation and no bad PR, they would give me a big bonus. So that's when I started to learn hands-on about negotiating with lenders, trying to turn things around.
Well, let's fast forward to 1990 or thereabouts, and
Okay.
you get into one negotiation which gets a little tense, shall
Yeah.
we say, and it had to do with the Taj Mahal in Atlantic City,
Yes.
and none other than Donald Trump. So tell us about that.
Yeah, I had gotten into distress on a big-time basis because of Mike Milken. Mike was then the key player at Drexel Burnham, and what he was doing was pioneering the creation of deliberately low-quality debt instruments, and I think he did the country in a lot of ways a great service with that. But anyhow, it seemed to me that that would inevitably mean there will also be more workouts, because if you're putting that much leverage on companies, some of them are going to get it wrong, some will go bust, some will need an out-of-court restructuring. So I teamed up with a very aggressive young lawyer, and we started going around to Drexel's clients and saying, Mike has been picking you off when the workout comes because his client is the issuer, so he's trying to get the best deal for the issuer, and that's fine. But because he's negotiating with you bondholders one by one, you have no leverage on him. You don't even know what else other bondholders are thinking. So we will organize the bondholders into a group, negotiate as a group. Now you have the leverage because he has to deal with you, and he can't make different deals with different people. So it got Mike a little bit cross that we were changing the game some, but it turned out to be a very good business. So segue to 1990, along comes the Taj Mahal. Merrill Lynch and Bear Stearns provided virtually all the financing for it through an $800 million mortgage bond offering for a company that had yet to open its first door. So it was literally a startup financing of a mortgage bond. Well, it never paid one coupon. Bonds, as you know, they pay coupon every 6 months. This one never paid a single coupon. So the bondholders are obviously pretty angry with that. So the Thursday evening before Labor Day weekend, they hire me to be their advisor along with my lawyer friend. So Trump called me up, and I knew him slightly just from around New York City. But he called me and he said, you got to come down tomorrow and I'll start having you do due diligence and we'll get going on the restructuring. That was the last thing I wanted to do, was to go to Atlantic City on Labor Day weekend. But anyhow, I showed up at the 63rd Street heliport, and there was this helicopter, about the same size as the Marine One that's here, but this one was silver colored, and it had in 5-foot-high red nail polish red letters TRUMP. So there was no real doubt whose plane it was. So I get into it. We go down to the steel pier in Atlantic City, the little stub that was left, and Trump's there in a big stretch limo. And I noticed on the front of the car there were 2 flags. One was naturally the American flag, and the other was a Trump flag. So it was almost as though you were getting a ride with a dictator of some Latin American country. So we drive about 150 feet to the casino. but we don't go in through the boardwalk entrance. We drive all the way around to the back with, meanwhile, people wanting to take pictures, Donald, Donald, screaming, yelling, a big uproarious crowd scene. And in the back, he did a big bus business. Buses would pick people up at all the little towns from New England down to Atlantic City, and then they would come to the casino. More adulation by the crowds. We get inside, place totally swarmed, people asking him to sign their beanie hat, sign their shirt, sign their little pad. One woman even had him sign her naked back. Now, what she was ever going to do with a signature on her naked back, I have no idea. But anyhow, it was a real outpouring of interest on the part of his customers. So he gave a very detailed tour of the facility, and it was clear he understood the business pretty well. He had his hands on what was going on. So that kind of impressed me. Then we went to his office, and he said, you know, your bondholders, they're going to be lucky to get the 20 cents on the dollar, which is where the bonds are trading. So I won't try to beat you down from there. If you'll take 20 cents, we can make a deal right now. And I said, well, sorry, Mr. Trump, but that's not my job. My job is to get them 100 cents plus their accrued interest. Then he said, well, never going to happen. So we got into a little bit of a pitched argument. And after an hour or two of it, I finally said to him, well, is that your position? And he said, yes, it is. And I said, well, then I'll see you sometime next week. I'm leaving. So I walked out on him. And he tells the story to this day. It was the first time anybody ever just walked out on him. And in a strange way, it gave us a bond, because that was the kind of thing that he might be inclined to do. So we got to understand each other a little. We then had a very public several months of bickering, where he was threatening to get me fired as the advisor to the bondholders, and saying all this and that and the other thing. And it was all playing itself out in the news media. And at one point, I said, Donald Trump is looking for a Christmas present, and it's not even Halloween yet, so it's premature. And it's also premature for the trick or treat that he's trying to play on the bondholders. So it was that kind of lively.
You had fun with us. Did you have fun with us? It sounds like it.
Yeah, that was sort of fun. Then eventually we go through all those shenanigans, and we finally got to the point where I thought there's not much. Meanwhile, we were getting him up some, but he still wasn't up to 100 cents. So I went with the lawyer one day to see him in the morning, and I said, Donald, this is really it. We either are going to get from you the 100 cents with the interest, or we'll get it out of the courtroom. And he said, no, I'm just not going to do it. I already went further than I had intended to. So I said, well, we'll see you in court. And I walked out on him again. And went back to my office, and we put out a press release about an hour later that said the bondholder committee of the Taj Mahal is going to hold an important press conference at the Marriott Marquis at 5 o'clock this evening. So he immediately, when I hit the news wire, he called me up, screaming, very unhappy, screaming and yelling, what is this about? You're doing a press conference at the Marriott Marquis. That was obviously not one of his hotels. So I said, well, I told you we will see you in court. We're going to announce we're filing an involuntary bankruptcy petition on you, and you're going to be in bankruptcy at about 6 o'clock this evening. So he said, just give me a little while to think about that. He called back. We made a few more little changes. And instead, he said, okay, we made our deal. We got our 100 cents. And we also got 49% of the stock to make up for all the hardship of not getting paid on time. So we then made the press conference at the Plaza Hotel, which had been one of his hotels and was right across the street from his office. So he explained that they had made a deal, and then I had to explain the technical part because we wanted to tread gingerly the idea that it was still going to go into bankruptcy, but it would be a friendly one, a so-called consensual proceeding, where it was just to make sure there were no stragglers hanging out. So I had to explain that it's a bankruptcy, but it isn't like a real regular bankruptcy. So as a gambler, you don't have to worry that he won't be able to pay when you break the bank and all that. And it won't affect the employees, it won't affect anything. It'll just be a technical thing going through the courts. So that's what the way the press played it up. And I was feeling pretty good because this had been a real struggle and a real public thing. So I get in the car, I'm going home, and I'm tired as can be because you use up a lot of nervous energy. Phone rings in the car. This is your mother calling. Oh. Have you lost all self-respect? What do you mean, Mom? She said, well, after all those mean things that he said about you, how could you possibly do business with him? I've been playing mahjong with my lady friends, and we all agree this is a disgrace. You should not have ever made a deal with him. And I said, oh, Mom, I'm just earning a living trying to help my clients make out. And she said, well, if you had become a lawyer like your father was, and like I always wanted you to do, you wouldn't have to hang around with people like that. And then she hung up.
More from a Reagan Forum featuring Wilbur Ross after this message.
The Ronald Reagan Presidential Foundation is the nonprofit organization created by President Reagan himself, and specifically charged by him with continuing his legacy and sharing his principles: individual liberty, economic opportunity, global democracy, and national pride. We must remain vigilant and work together to share these conservative principles with younger generations. Your role is critical to move our mission forward. Thank you for your continued support. Please visit reaganfoundation.org/give. That's reaganfoundation.org/give.
Now back to a Reagan Forum featuring Secretary Wilbur Ross.
So let's fast forward again. Now at this point, you're in your late 70s.
Yeah.
And Donald Trump gets elected president, and he calls you up, or you actually go interview with him, and he offers you a job.
Yeah, well, it really started a little bit before that when he announced he was running for the third time. He had toyed with running a couple of times before, but this time when he came down that big fancy staircase at the Trump Tower, Hillary and I were watching it on TV, and it seemed to us like maybe he was a little more serious this time. And as it turned out, he was deadly serious, and he really was running. And I felt he was the only one of the candidates who truly understood the agony of middle-class America, and that they were fed up being worked over, fed up being left behind, fed up not getting an ability to keep up with inflation. And therefore, I thought he had an excellent chance not only to win, but to fix the problems. Because the other candidates, as far as I could tell, didn't even understand the problem. Well, how the hell are you going to fix the problem if you don't understand it? So one morning I was on Squawk Box on CNBC, and they asked me, they said, well, if Trump is elected as the nominee for the Republican Party, would you support him? And they were frankly thinking I would say hell no, because that was what most of Wall Street was saying. And I said, no, of course I will support him, and I explained why. So that was the start of our romance with a lot of time in between. And it turned out to be right. I think it was partly due to his experience, both in the hotel business and in the casino business, because he had a lot of middle and lower middle class customers in both. So he had more interaction, more real one-on-one relationship with those parts of the American public than Bush or any of the other mainline Republican candidates, and certainly more than the Democratic candidates. So I started raising some funds for him and started writing editorials. Wrote, I don't know, 30 or 40 editorials, mostly for regional newspapers, explaining why I thought he should be president and explaining some of the policy programs that he would be putting in. So we get to the convention. That goes very nicely. And at the convention, he appointed Chris Christie to be the head of the transition team. Whenever there's a person who's not the incumbent elected president, they make a transition team who helps them figure out who to put into the various positions, all sorts of important activities. And in fact, the government pays for it. The GSA had a fairly big building on 17th Street in Washington, which was where the transition office was based. And initially they had two, one for Hillary and one for Trump, but Hillary turned out not to need hers, so the only populated one was Trump's. But how did I actually get the appointment? Shortly after the election, I got a call from someone on the transition committee saying, could you go out to his golf club in New Jersey on the Friday right after Thanksgiving? They didn't say what it was about, but you could figure that it would have something to do with the new administration. And I had talked with the transition people earlier and said to them what I would like, since they were asking me what I would like to do. I said, if he doesn't give it to Mnuchin, which I think he probably will, because Steve was his kind of chief fundraiser, I said, if they don't give Treasury to Mnuchin, I would like Treasury. If they do give Mnuchin Treasury, I'd like Commerce. So that was as far as it had gotten. So I get out there, and the press was mob scene outside the front door to his golf club. But the pretty young lady, one of his aides, had us drive around to the back, go up the back stairs to a kind of holding bin where they were serving cold cuts and drinks and what have you. So eventually my turn came, and to get ready for it, I had put together a 100-day program. I'd been analyzing commerce and things that I thought could be done with it and about it, and how it would fit in with his agenda. So I had made a whole bunch of copies of it, had it in a briefcase. And so when I got ushered in, it was Trump, it was Pence, it was Kellyanne Conway, it was Ronald Priebus, who then was the chair of the RNC, it was a whole lot of people, Steve Bannon, a lot of his advisors, all seated around a little table with a chair by it. So I greeted everybody, sat down. I started to open my briefcase to take out my brilliant 100-day plan, because that was going to be my big sales pitch. And Trump stood up and he said, "Wilbur, there's no need for a sales pitch. We've decided to give you commerce." And so that was bing, like that. And it was in some ways typical of his decision-making. He had already made his mind up, so there was no need to go through the ritual of a formal presentation. They knew what they were going to do. He didn't want to waste time, because he's impatient. He's always impatient about things happening. And so we did that. And so he said, "No, you can't tell anyone except for Hillary until we make the announcement. And meanwhile, the FBI will do character check and all this and that. And we will announce you and Mnuchin simultaneously as the new kind of economic team." And so that's what happened. And that was more complicated getting through the congressional hearings than it was getting the nod from Trump. The transition team had set up a tutoring session, so every day, starting right after the 1st of January, every day I would spend my whole day in the transition office. Part of it, where they had people who had formerly served in the Commerce Department educating me on all the details of it, and the rest of the day pretending I was at the hearing. And they literally set up a room to look just like a Senate hearing room. And they were up high, and you were down in front, and you had this little desk with a little clock, because at hearings, the world is divided into 5-minute intervals. The chairman makes a little talk, 5 minutes, then the ranking member, which is the most senior opposing party, and went back and forth like that, and then you would get your 5 minutes. So very ritualistic, and they were impersonating them so well, they even impersonated the accents. One had a big Boston accent, one had a big Southern accent, so it was meant to really prepare you for the environment. And they had done very careful homework. What were the kinds of questions each person was likely to ask you? So I felt pretty well prepared. And then next step was make the rounds, courtesy calls on first on Schumer, and then on the committee chairs and the committee members and the senior people in the Senate. Only the Senate gets to vote on cabinet. The House doesn't get to vote.
And you knew Schumer before this.
Yeah, I knew Schumer before.
And tell us how he reacted.
In fact, when I had been a Democrat and a Democratic fundraiser, and in fact at age 29 I became the treasurer of the Democratic State Committee in the state of New York. So I was pretty involved structurally, and I knew Schumer from that. I actually at one point gave him one of his early fundraisers. Anyhow, so I spent an hour chatting with him very amiably, and at the end of it, since I had learned on Wall Street one thing, always ask for the order. And so I said, well, Mr. Leader, since we've had this history, I hope I can count on your support for my designation as Commerce Secretary. And he said, Wilbur, not a chance in the world. I said, not a chance in the world? Why is that? He said, you must remember, I'm the loyal opposition. And he didn't vote for me. It was a very bipartisan vote. I got 72 yeses, 27 nays, and one non-voting person. So we got confirmed all right. The confirmation hearing itself was another scene. A lady showed up there dressed as Marie Antoinette, And as I started to make my remarks, she started throwing bits of cake out at the audience. Let them eat cake, you know.
But
So the sergeant at arms ushered her out, so that was the end of that. And so I said, which brought everybody to laughter, I said, you can probably appreciate she was not part of my prepared remarks.
so you made it through.
Yeah.
So what was it like being Secretary of Commerce? Tell everybody, please, what does the Secretary of Commerce do, and what accomplishments are you most proud of?
Yeah, well, commerce is like a huge conglomerate. It has more different activities than any other branch of government. We have the National Weather Service. We operate 17 space satellites. We have the Foreign Commercial Services, which has offices in 72 diplomatic posts around the world to try to promote American business. We have the Patent Office, the Trademark Office, the Department of Science and Technology. We have the Census Bureau. We have the Bureau of Economic Advice. We emit 40% of all the factual information that comes out of the U.S. government. So it has a huge reporting kind of a function. A lot of those announcements that come at 8:30 in the morning on a Wednesday or a Friday about unemployment, about this and that, a lot of those come from the Department of Commerce. And in my case, there were also some duties that got added. President Trump appointed me to the National Security Council, to the principals group. So that meant I got the same briefings he did every morning. And that was the most fascinating part of the job. Some days it was a little scary, but it was always fascinating. And he reactivated the Space Council. And so I became quite enthralled with the prospects for commercialization of space and for space activity in general. And in fact, the only editorial the New York Times ever published for me was one I wrote on space and why space would be important. And they didn't put that in the business section, they put it in the science section. That was as close as they could come to giving a Trump appointee editorial space in the New York Times. So there were those, and then Ivanka Trump invited me to be the co-chair with her of the workforce development activity. We had concluded that one of the big problems, especially back then, was that there were millions more jobs available than unemployed people, but many of the people weren't qualified to perform the jobs. And so this idea was, we went around to big companies all around the US. We did a real barnstorming, getting them to agree to provide paid apprenticeships to people, either older people who had lost their jobs or wanted to upgrade, or younger people needing to work for the first time. And we got the companies to agree to provide almost 10 million apprenticeships over the next 5-year period. So we were very proud of it, but you had to make a lot of house calls to get 10 million companies to commit. So those were some of the functions of commerce.
And you were on the cutting edge of President Trump's China policy.
Well, yeah, that was
the
other thing. The policy side, we had two main functions. One was working with them on trade policy, because a lot of the tariff capabilities were in commerce, and the export control capabilities to keep militarily sensitive products from being exported to bad people. So those were two giant things. The other part of it was we are also statutorily the telecom advisor to the president. And telecom then as now was a very hot area, all kinds of things going on. So it was fundamentally a 16-hour-a-day job, but it was exhilarating and it was exciting because you were making big things happen and you got to feel like you were a little part of the history book in motion.
Our time is starting to draw to a close. You prospered greatly in the 80s. You were a Democrat in the 80s. You eventually became a Republican.
Right.
What was it like living through the Reagan era, and what does Ronald Reagan mean to you?
Well, I think he's the shining example of what the presidency should be and what its priorities should be. Why the Republican Party, to a fairly large degree, kind of lost track of that during intervening years, I've never been able quite to figure out. But there was a lot of misplaced emphasis post Ronald Reagan. So I think he is correctly a role model for us going forward. Now, the exact things he did, we don't have to do all over. There is no Berlin Wall, but there are the equivalent of Berlin Walls all over the place that need to be dealt with. We don't exactly have Star Wars, but we're getting there. And so there's a real life similarity between that challenge and his. He too pioneered workforce development and things that led to an improved workforce. And his social policies did not go in the direction that we've seen more recently, particularly on the Democratic side, this notion of paying people more not to work than they ever got paid when they were working strikes me as the death knell for the American dream. And in fact, I learned not too long ago, there's actually a Reddit site on the internet that is devoted to anti-work. Anti-work. 6 million people are subscribers to this site, and they post some of the most incredible things you can imagine. A frequent post will be something like, I just can't force myself to go to work anymore. So the notion that work is an aberration or something that you have to be pushed into doing rather than something that's normal and constructive is a very poor notion, and it is the complete antithesis of Ronald Reagan, for that matter of Donald Trump and a lot of other people. So I think that the spirit of Reagan must be recaptured and must be fulfilled, or we're going to go seriously off course, because the world fundamentals have gotten more complicated than they were back when he was leading the charge, but his basic principles are right. Now, some of the details, like he was more of a free trader than I think we can afford to be these days, because there have been so many trade abuses, and we haven't really talked much about that today. But so some of the specifics are necessarily different, but I think directionally, there's no question in my mind, his direction was and continues to be the right direction.
As you look to, in closing, as you look to America's future, are you optimistic? Is there a call to action? Certainly your advice, your book is full of advice, but what is your call to action to the American people?
I think the biggest threat to America is our educational system, because they are no longer properly preparing young people for the realities of the business economy, nor are they even properly preparing them for adulthood in my book. And I'll give you a couple little tidbits. We're also involved with the Milken Institute long since the bankruptcy days. Anyhow, Milken Institute was very concerned that the LA school system has dropped teaching high school math. So they sent one of their people, one of the staffers, over to talk to the man who's responsible for it. And the fellow said to him, well, how can this be right? How are you not teaching high school math in what's clearly becoming an increasingly technological environment? How can this possibly make any sense? And the guy's answer was, mathematics is a racist activity. And we said, mathematics is a racist activity. What on earth can you possibly be thinking? And he said, name me a black mathematician. The idea that you should view math through that kind of a very narrow prism is just weird. And I'll give you two more examples. One of the Midwestern universities surveys each year people 18 to 25 years of age, and they ask them a whole bunch of unusual questions, trying to get a feel for what these kids are thinking of. Well, I call them kids. At my age, you can afford to call 25-year-old a kid. Anyway, so one of the questions that was on the most recent survey was, where was slavery invented? You know what the most popular answer was?
United States.
United States.
It's not true.
Even though it's thousands of years inaccurate and thousands of miles inaccurate. That was the most popular answer. The one that amused me the most, that one didn't amuse me at all because it showed such a fundamental lack of understanding. Not that I was for slavery, not that I think it was justified. I mean, there are a lot of horrible things about it, but at least they ought to know what it came from and how it came to be and what's the actual history of it. The second one was, who was Andrew Jackson? You all know Andrew Jackson was a president, a controversial president. Most popular answer, Michael's brother. When you have a new people to the electorate who don't know anything about our history and don't even know much about pop culture, we're in trouble. And if our educational system doesn't get reformed and doesn't get reformed quickly, we're going to get what we deserve, which is going back to primitive society, because that's all we're going to be capable of doing. So I'm worried about China, sure, and we took a lot of measures against China. That's why they sanctioned me. There are other problems too, Russia, Iran, all these threats. But the one thing that's within our immediate power to cure is the educational system. And if we don't get on with it, nothing else is going to make much difference longer term. So that's both my optimistic thing if we fix it and my pessimistic thing if we don't. And I was very encouraged. We were in Austin, Texas yesterday, a bunch of venture capital people who turned out to be very conservative thinking people. They put on a book party for me. And that group is founded, with the inception being this fall, a university to teach the way that Harvard and Yale used to teach and have the curriculum that schools like that used to have, not a woke curriculum.
You might appreciate that the Reagan Foundation hosts an annual Reagan Institute Summit on Education, and for the last 2 years, we've had the president of the University of Austin, which is the university you're referencing, be our guest.
Yes.
I also want to call out, we have here in the audience Dr. Richard Schroeder, who is our Chief Education and Programming Officer here at the Reagan Foundation.
Great.
We educate and train tens of thousands of students in person, and the next horizon for us is to reach the millions of students who will never be able to physically come, but we obviously want to reach them, and if we can't bring them here, we want to go to them. We need to close, but I can't commend the book enough to you. It is full of advice, full of insights, some of them extremely timely in terms of what's in the news, and I'm going to close by quoting you, Mr. Secretary, in your book. One element of advice that you shared is, quote, "You are ultimately the only person who can hold yourself back, and you cannot build anything based on negativity. Do not be afraid of taking rational risks. I have found that accepting them is the essential ingredient to achieving high-level returns. Just make sure you think them through." Unquote. So with that, let's thank Secretary Ross.
Signed copies of Risks and Returns can be purchased through the Reagan Library Museum Store. Every purchase you make from our catalog, website, or museum store is a critical component to our success. In short, your purchase supports our efforts to extend the legacy of President Ronald Reagan. Purchases can be made at reaganlibrary.com/store. To find a listing of all upcoming events, please visit reaganfoundation.org/events. Thank you for listening. For more information on the Ronald Reagan Presidential Foundation and Institute, including information on how to become a member, information on upcoming exhibits at the Reagan Library, and more information on the legacy of President Reagan, please visit reaganfoundation.org. And don't forget to like and follow the Reagan Foundation on all social media platforms.
Until next week, thanks for listening. God bless you.
Don't forget to subscribe to A Reagan Forum podcast in your iTunes or Google Play stores, and on other podcast platforms as they become available. New episodes of A Reagan Forum come out every Thursday. Like what you hear? Check out our Words to Live By podcast, featuring radio addresses and speeches Ronald Reagan delivered from the 1960s through the 1980s. New episodes drop every Tuesday. And don't forget to follow @Ronald Reagan on Facebook, @Ronald Reagan on Twitter, and Reagan Foundation on YouTube. Also, search for us on SoundCloud and Stitcher.